The guard in the northwest tower at Sun Tae had been on duty since midnight. 4 hours of nothing. Frogs in the patties, mosquitoes, the distant grind of a truck on Route 15 somewhere south. The compound held fewer prisoners than it used to. Transfers had thinned the population weeks ago, but nobody told the guards to relax. So he stood there, rifle slung, watching absolutely nothing happen in the dark. At 2:18 a.m., the nothing ended. The sound came first. A low chop from the west, the kind that could be a supply helicopter running late to Gia Lam. Except it got louder, and then there were more of them. Multiple sets of rotors, moving fast, and the guard realized they were coming in without lights. No navigation strobes, no landing floods, just the sound of something very large and very close bearing down on the compound at treetop level. He never got a round off. What hit Sun Tae prison camp wasn't a raid in any sense the North Vietnamese had trained for. An HH-3, Jolly Green Giant, 14 tons of helicopter, came in over the south wall and didn't land outside the perimeter. It didn't hover. The pilot, Air Force Major Herb Kalin, drove the aircraft directly into the courtyard and crash-landed it there on purpose. The rotor blades chewed through a tree and threw debris across the yard. The fuselage cracked open like an egg dropped on concrete. 14 Green Berets came out of the wreckage shooting. The whole thing lasted 27 minutes, from the first shots to the last helicopter lifting off, less than half an hour. And in that half hour, a 56-man American Special Operations Force, Army Rangers, Green Berets, Air Force combat controllers, fought their way through a fortified compound deep inside North Vietnam, killed between 40 and 200 defenders, depending on which source gets trusted, and then extracted clean. 0 American dead, 2 injuries, one of them a broken ankle from the crash. By any tactical standard, Sun Tae was the most successful special operations raid in American military history up to that point. There was one problem. The camp was empty. Every prisoner had been moved weeks before the raid launched. 56 men risked their lives flying 116 miles into enemy territory, and the intelligence that put them there was already dead. If this is the first time the Sun Tae raid has crossed the screen, do the digging yourself afterward. The declassified after-action report is worth every page. Drop what surprised you most in the comments, and hit subscribe so the channel stays findable. A like helps too if the story earns it. The Pentagon called it a failure. The men who planned it called it a success executed against bad luck. The prisoners who weren't there, the ones Sun Tae was supposed to rescue, had a different word for it entirely. The photographs came first, months before anyone picked up a weapon. In May of 1970, an SR-71 Blackbird banking over the Red River Delta at 80,000 feet caught something on film that made an analyst at Fort Belvoir stop eating his lunch. Tiny figures in a compound 23 miles west of Hanoi, arranged in patterns that didn't match Vietnamese military formations. They were exercising, moving in groups, and someone, this analyst whose name never made it into the declassified record, noticed that the shadows were wrong for Vietnamese body types. Too tall. The figures were American. Buffalo Hunter drones confirmed it over the next several weeks. Low-altitude passes, camera pods slung under modified Ryan 154s that flew pre-programmed routes and didn't care about AAA because nobody was inside. The resolution was good enough to count heads. 55 Americans, maybe more, penned inside a compound the size of a football field. Sun Tae. The problem landed on the desk of Brigadier General Leroy Manor at Eglin Air Force Base, and Manor looked at it the way a man looks at a car wreck he's been asked to reverse. The camp sat deep inside North Vietnam's most heavily defended airspace. Surface-to-air missile sites ringed Hanoi in overlapping kill zones, 12,000 of them within a 30-mile radius. MiG interceptors at 3 airfields within minutes of the target. Anti-aircraft batteries so dense that pilots called the area around Hanoi, downtown, the way a boxer calls a good punch. Hello. Getting a rescue force in meant threading through all of it at night, hitting one specific compound, and getting out before the entire North Vietnamese air defense network woke up and closed the door. Manor brought in Colonel Arthur Bull Simons to build the ground force. Simons was 52 years old, built like a refrigerator someone had taught to walk, and had been running special operations since World War II. He'd led Ranger missions behind Japanese lines in the Philippines. He'd run covert ops in Laos that the government still won't fully acknowledge. When Manor told him the mission parameters, Simons called it the most dangerous operation he'd ever seen proposed. He said yes before Manor finished the briefing. What followed was 5 months of the most intensive mission preparation the American military had ever attempted for a single raid. Simons and Manor had a full-scale replica of the Sun-Tae compound built at Eglin's Auxiliary Field 3, working from the drone photographs and satellite imagery. The mock-up went up at night and came down before dawn, so Soviet reconnaissance satellites couldn't photograph it on their orbital passes. 170 rehearsals. The assault teams ran the hit so many times that individual soldiers later said they could have done it blindfolded, and at least one of them, a sergeant whose after-action interview surfaced in 2008, used almost exactly those words. He said the compound felt more familiar than his own apartment. The volunteer selection was brutal by design. Simons wanted men from the 6th and 7th Special Forces groups, plus Air Force Special Operations crews, and he wanted them ignorant. Nobody was told the actual target. The recruitment pitch was a single sentence delivered to each candidate individually. This mission is considered to be moderately hazardous. That language came straight from the operational planning document. Moderately hazardous, for a night raid into the most defended airspace on Earth. The men who volunteered understood military understatement well enough to hear what the sentence actually meant. Every single one volunteered. Not one dropped out during 5 months of training. By October of 1970, the force was ready. 56 operators, a supporting air armada of over 100 aircraft, and an intelligence estimate that said 55 American prisoners were waiting inside that compound for someone to come get them. The intelligence estimate was already wrong. The prisoners had been moved to a camp called Dong Hoi in July, 14 weeks before the raid launched, but nobody at Eglin knew that, because the one agency that might have, the CIA, wasn't talking to the Pentagon that month, hadn't been for months. The mock-up went up in pieces, hauled on flatbeds under tarps to Auxiliary Field 3 starting in late June. Lumber, corrugated metal, cinder block walls poured to match the exact height the drone photographs showed. The construction crews worked between midnight and 4:30 a.m. exclusively. Soviet Cosmos satellites passed over Eglin on predictable orbital windows, and the replica had to be invisible by dawn. Every morning before sunrise, camouflage netting went over the whole thing. Every night it came off and the rehearsals started. They called the compound Barbara. The name had no significance anyone ever admitted to. Manor's planning staff assigned code names from a list, and Barbara is what Sun-Tae got. The replica itself was accurate to an almost obsessive degree. Guard tower placement matched to within inches. Wall heights confirmed against shadow length calculations from multiple SR-71 passes. Interior building dimensions extrapolated from overhead imagery and cross-referenced with CIA ground reports that were already months stale. The irrigation ditch running along the compound's south side got replicated too, down to approximate water depth calculated from seasonal rainfall data for Sontai province. This level of detail for a target that would be hit in darkness by men wearing night vision equipment that turned everything into green soup. But Simons insisted, and when Bull Simons insisted on something, the appropriate institutional response was to do it and skip the argument. The assault force split into 3 groups. Blue Boy, 14 men under Captain Dick Meadows, would ride the crash-landing helicopter directly into the compound courtyard. Greenleaf, 22 men under Simons himself, would hit the south wall and clear the exterior guard positions. Red Wine, 20 men under Lieutenant Colonel Elliot Bud Sidner, would secure the outside perimeter and handle any reaction force from the nearby Sun-Tae military installation, which sat 400 meters east and housed several hundred North Vietnamese troops. The timing between groups was measured in seconds, not minutes. Blue Boy had to be on the ground and shooting before Greenleaf breached the wall, and Red Wine had to own the perimeter before the garrison next door figured out what the noise was. 170 times they ran it. The operation shrank from a projected 4 minutes to 26 seconds for initial compound clearance. Meadows was the one who figured out the courtyard landing. The original plan called for all 3 groups to land outside the walls and breach inward. Meadows looked at the compound dimensions, looked at the response time estimates for the nearby garrison, and told Manor that breaching from outside would cost them 90 seconds they didn't have. Put a helicopter inside the walls. Manor said the courtyard was too small. Meadows said the HH-3 could fit if the pilot was good enough and didn't care about the helicopter afterward. Manor found the pilot. The men still didn't know where they were going. Simons told them in late October, 3 weeks before launch. The room went quiet when the maps came out and the target location registered. Then somebody asked about the route home, and Simons laid out the extraction plan, and the room got quieter. 400 meters south of the compound, there was a building the planners had labeled a secondary school. It wasn't a secondary school. Simons and Greenleaf found this out the hard way. The lead helicopter, navigating by infrared on a moonless night over terrain that looked nothing like the photographs when seen at rotor height, put Greenleaf's 22 men on the ground at the wrong compound. The buildings were similar enough in layout. The walls were roughly the right shape, and in the green-black wash of early night vision equipment, similar was identical. Simons knew something was off within seconds of touching dirt. The trees were wrong. The courtyard dimensions felt compressed underfoot. Spatial memory from 170 rehearsals, telling his legs what his eyes couldn't confirm. Then someone inside started shooting, and the question of location became academic. The firefight lasted maybe 4 minutes. Greenleaf killed between 40 and 100 personnel inside that compound. The count varies wildly depending on the source, and the after-action report uses language so carefully vague it reads like a lawyer drafted it, which somebody probably did. The defenders fought back with small arms and what Simons later described as a level of discipline that surprised him. These weren't conscript guards pulling overnight shifts. They moved in pairs, used cover. Several of them died in positions that suggested coordinated fire, not panic. The official record calls them North Vietnamese military personnel. The unofficial record, the one that lives in debriefing transcripts that took decades to surface, suggests they were Chinese advisors, possibly Soviet. The physical descriptions don't match, and neither does the equipment recovered. Someone in the Defense Intelligence Agency wrote a memo about this 11 days after the raid, and that memo got classified at a level that means nobody in the building wanted to have the conversation it would start. The DIA memo stayed buried until 1996, and even then it came out with so many redactions, the readable portions barely fill half a page. This irritates me more than it should. 26 years to release a document that still doesn't say anything, which is its own kind of admission. Simons got his men reorganized in under 90 seconds. He radioed Sydnor with the correct situation, reboarded the helicopter, and redirected to Sun Tay proper. The detour cost Greenleaf roughly 5 minutes of total mission time. 5 minutes that every man in the planning cell had spent months shaving seconds to eliminate. By the time Simons hit the south wall of the actual compound, Meadows and Blue Boy had already crashed through the courtyard and were clearing buildings alone. 26 seconds. That was the rehearsed time for initial compound clearance at Barbara. Meadows beat it by 3. The HH-3 Jolly Green came in nose-high over the south wall, rotor wash flattening everything underneath that wasn't bolted to concrete, and the pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Warner Britton, did exactly what Meadows had promised Manor he would do. He put the helicopter into the courtyard, like threading a school bus through a hallway, shearing the rotor blades on a tree and a light pole on the way down. The skids hit dirt, and the aircraft wasn't flying again. That was the plan. Blue Boy was out and moving before the fuselage stopped rocking. Meadows went through the front door of the first cell block firing. The CAR-15 had a penlight taped to the handguard, a modification so crude it would have gotten him written up at Fort Bragg, and it threw a wobbling circle of white light across walls that were exactly where his muscle memory said they'd be. Same dimensions as Barbara? Same door frames? The smell was different. Mildew and human waste and something acrid that stuck in the back of the throat. The particular smell of a place where men had lived without plumbing for years. His boots hit standing water in the first corridor, maybe 2 inches deep. Warm. The cells were open. Every door along the first block stood unlocked. Some pushed flat against the wall. Others half closed in the way doors settle when nobody touches them for weeks. Meadows cleared each one. Cot frames with no bedding. Tin cups. A sandal. What people leave behind when they go and don't take anything with them. Blue Boy swept the second cell block in under a minute. Same result. Open doors, empty rooms, signs that men had been here, but no men. A team member found scratches on a wall that might have been tally marks. Days, weeks, the kind of thing a man does when he has nothing else to decide. The marks stopped abruptly at what could have been 112 or 117. Hard to read by penlight while the perimeter was still unsecured. Sydnor's red wine element had the outside locked down by now, gun jeeps positioned to cover the road from the nearby garrison. The North Vietnamese troops 400 meters east should have been reacting. The Navy's diversionary strikes over Haiphong had pulled air defense attention away from Sun Tay, and the A-1 Sky Raiders orbiting overhead were loud enough to mask the ground noise, but 400 meters is close enough to hear helicopter rotors shearing metal. The garrison never came. Whether they were confused, undermanned, or had standing orders not to engage an unknown force in darkness, the records don't clarify. The absence just sits there in the timeline, unexplained. Meadows keyed his radio. The call went to the orbiting C-130 that served as mission command, and the transcript, when it finally appeared in declassified form, is 4 words long. Negative items. Negative items meant no prisoners found. The compound was clean. Son Tay was empty, had been empty for months, and 56 Americans were now standing inside a drained prison in North Vietnamese airspace with nothing left to do there. The extraction took 11 minutes. Simons pulled Greenleaf and Blue Boy out through the courtyard, loaded onto the backup HH-3s that had been holding in an orbit pattern over the Song Con River. Sydnor collapsed the perimeter last, leapfrogging fire teams backward to the landing zone, while the Sky Raiders kept the sky noisy. Every man got out. No American casualties beyond one broken ankle from the courtyard crash landing, and a round through a team member's boot that missed his foot by the width of a bootlace. 27 minutes on the ground total. A textbook operation against an empty building. The helicopters turned southeast toward Udorn, Thailand, and behind them Son Tay sat dark and quiet with its cell doors hanging open to nothing. The Song Con River crested on July 14, 1970. Satellite imagery from that week shows the water table around Son Tay prison rising to within a foot of the compound walls. The irrigation ditch on the south side completely submerged, indistinguishable from the surrounding paddy. The National Reconnaissance Office had the photographs. The Defense Intelligence Agency had the photographs. The CIA had separate photographs from a different satellite entirely. 3 agencies looking at the same flooded river valley through 3 different camera systems, and not one of them flagged what it meant for the 50-odd Americans living at ground level inside those walls. The North Vietnamese moved the prisoners on foot. 15 miles east to a facility American intelligence would later designate Dong Hoi, tucked closer to Hanoi where the terrain sat higher and the monsoon drainage ran away from the buildings instead of through them. A practical decision. Guards don't want to wade through sewage-contaminated floodwater any more than prisoners do. The transfer took most of a day. Roughly 65 men walking a road that ran parallel to a river that American reconnaissance aircraft photographed routinely. The July imagery exists. Whether anyone looked at it with the right question in mind is a different matter. What happened next is the part that should bother people. Manner's planning cell at Eglin continued rehearsing against Barbara through August, September, October. The SR-71 kept flying over Son Tay. The compound was still there. The walls were still standing. But the indicators that the camp was occupied, laundry on lines, worn footpaths between buildings, the particular pattern of ground disturbance that signals daily human traffic, those indicators were gone, absent from imagery that analysts were reviewing specifically to confirm the target was still viable. The August pass showed no laundry. The September pass showed vegetation growing across previously bare footpaths. Weeds don't grow where men walk every day. A photo interpreter at the 559th Tactical Reconnaissance Wing at Udorn flagged the vegetation change in a supplementary note attached to a routine image assessment. The note went into a file. The file went into a system that routed it to DIA. DIA was not, at that moment, sharing intelligence with the Joint Contingency Task Group running the Son Tay operation, because the task group's existence was compartmented at a level that made interagency coordination something between difficult and fictional. The bureaucratic architecture of American intelligence in 1970 fascinates me. 17 separate organizations with overlapping mandates, competing budgets, institutional memories that stretched back to turf wars older than most of the analysts working the desks, and procurement pipelines that guaranteed none of them were looking at the same version of any given photograph on the same day. The National Security Agency was intercepting North Vietnamese communications that mentioned prisoner transfers in Son Tay province. Those intercepts sat in a queue at Fort Meade, Maryland, waiting for a customer who had the clearance to receive them and the context to know what they meant. The customer existed. He was at Eglin, running nighttime rehearsals against a plywood compound. Nobody introduced them. The raid launched on November 21st. The prisoners had been gone 130 days. November 23rd, 1970, 2 days after the raid. A prisoner in Camp Faith, one of the satellite facilities northeast of Hanoi, heard boots in the corridor at a time when boots didn't come. Guards opened every cell in sequence, pulled men into the yard, and started loading them onto trucks without explanation. No blindfolds this time. The guards were rushing. Within 72 hours, the North Vietnamese consolidated nearly every American prisoner in the country into a handful of camps. The largest receiving facility was Hoa Lo Prison, the Hilton, in the terminology that had become so common even some guards used it. Men who had spent years in solitary, in cells so narrow their shoulders touched opposite walls when they lay on their backs, were suddenly shoved into rooms holding 40, 50 men at a time. The compression was immediate and disorienting. Air that had been dead silence for years was now voices, coughing, breathing, the rustle of bodies shifting on concrete at night. Isolation does something to the body that only registers once it stops. Men who hadn't been touched by another person in 3-4 years flinched at accidental contact. Skin that hadn't felt anything but walls and floor suddenly registering the warmth of a shoulder pressed against theirs in a room packed too tight for everyone to lie down at once. Why did Hanoi consolidate? The raid had demonstrated that American Special Operations Forces could reach a compound deep inside North Vietnam, kill everyone guarding it, and leave before the local garrison figured out what happened. Every small camp in the Red River Delta was now a liability. Dispersal had been the strategy. Spread the Americans across dozens of sites, make rescue impossible through sheer mathematics. Sun Tay inverted that logic overnight. Dispersal now meant vulnerability, so the prisoners came in. The tap code carried the news. For those unfamiliar with it, the grid system POWs used to communicate through walls, a 5x5 letter matrix where each letter gets 2 sets of taps, row then column. It was the nervous system of the prisoner community. Slow, tedious, astonishingly resilient. The guards knew about it, punished men for it, never managed to kill it. Word of the Sun Tay raid moved through Hoa Lo's walls faster than the North Vietnamese expected because the consolidation had done something Hanoi hadn't anticipated. It put communicators next to each other. Men who had been tapping to nobody, maintaining the discipline of the code against empty adjacent cells, were suddenly tapping to rooms full of listeners. The network went from a string of isolated nodes to a dense grid in the space of a week. What the tap code carried was simple. Americans came. They came into North Vietnam, into the ground defenses, at night, to get us out. The fact that Sun Tay was empty when they arrived, the prisoners knew this. The details filtered through within days didn't diminish it. The mission hadn't rescued anyone. The mission had proved that Washington would risk 56 men on a flight into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth for the possibility of bringing prisoners home. Years of silence from the other side of the war. The anti-war movement growing through scraps of propaganda the guards selectively shared. The grinding doubt that settles into a man who doesn't know if his country remembers his name. The raid answered something. Morale in the camps changed measurably. Senior officers who had been documenting prisoner mental states through the TAP network for years noted the shift in language. Fewer men talking about how long, more men talking about when. The distinction matters. How long is endurance without horizon? When is endurance with a point? The guards noticed too. Treatment improved, not from compassion, but from the sudden awareness that these prisoners might actually go home someday, and they would talk. Manner's after-action report landed on the Joint Chief's desk before the helicopters cooled down at Udorn. 17 pages, single-spaced, no hedging. The mission had failed its primary objective and succeeded at everything else, and Manner knew the difference mattered more than the headlines would suggest. Every man returned. Every phase executed within seconds of the timeline. The deliberate crash landing, the coordinated suppression, the perimeter collapse, all of it worked against a target that happened to be empty. The machinery was sound. The intelligence was broken. So what did the Pentagon learn? The honest answer is, it depended on who was reading. The Special Forces community treated Sun Tay like scripture. Small unit, extensive rehearsal, purpose-built task organization, every man knowing every other man's role down to which door he entered and which direction he turned. Simons had insisted on over 100 full-profile rehearsals at Eglin, night after night against that plywood compound, until the raiders could clear Barbara blindfolded. Some of them essentially did. The principle underneath was simple enough that it fit on an index card. Train the plan until the plan becomes reflexive, then trust the reflex when everything goes sideways. Meadows landing in the wrong compound and adapting within seconds wasn't luck. It was the product of a man who had walked through so many variations of failure during rehearsal that the real thing just looked like another iteration. The conventional military establishment drew a different lesson, and a more consequential one. The Joint Task Force model, pulling personnel from multiple branches under a single commander with direct authority and minimal bureaucratic layering, had worked at Sun Tae precisely because Manor operated outside normal channels. He reported to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, bypassing MACV, Pacific Command, and the usual hierarchy that turned every decision into a committee vote and every timeline into a negotiation. The task force existed in a bureaucratic vacuum, which is why it could move fast and also why its intelligence was catastrophically stale. The same isolation that gave Manor operational speed cut him off from the agencies that could have told him the prisoners were gone. Speed and blindness came from the same structural decision. 10 years later, Desert 1, April 25, 1980. 8 helicopters launched from the carrier Nimitz toward a staging site in the Iranian desert, carrying Delta Force operators tasked with rescuing 53 American hostages in Tehran. The mission had every problem Sun Tae didn't. Inter-service rivalry fractured the command structure. Marine pilots flying Navy helicopters under an Army ground commander who reported to a joint task force that answered to the White House through a chain so convoluted that when things started breaking, nobody could make a decision fast enough to matter. 3 helicopters went down to mechanical failure, and a haboob, a desert dust storm that the meteorological section had flagged as probable and the planners had categorized as acceptable risk. The abort came at the desert strip. Then an RH-53 collided with a C-130 during repositioning, and 8 Americans burned to death in the fireball. The wreckage sat in the Iranian desert for weeks. Tehran put the bodies on television. Charlie Beckwith, the Delta commander, said afterward that the failure wasn't about courage or capability. The operators were ready. The architecture around them wasn't. He'd read Manor's report. He'd said so before the mission launched. The parts he'd underlined were about command unity and rehearsal density. The parts the Pentagon had implemented were about neither. 13 years after that, Mogadishu, Task Force Ranger. The lessons from Sun Tae, unlearned, relearned, then unlearned, before anyone retired. The institutional memory of the American Military for Special Operations Doctrine has the half-life of a congressional term. Then, Abbottabad, May 1, 2011. 2 modified Black Hawks crossing into Pakistani airspace, carrying 23 SEALs from Naval Special Warfare Development Group. The mission architecture was Sun Tae rebuilt by people who had studied every failure since. Unified command under McRaven. Extensive full-profile rehearsals against a compound mock-up, this one built in North Carolina and again in Nevada. 2 separate replicas to prevent pattern recognition by satellite. A deliberately crashed helicopter in the courtyard, planned for and adapted to in real time because the contingency had been rehearsed. The intelligence failure that gutted Sun Tae had been addressed through a collection apparatus so dense that the CIA had been watching the Abbottabad compound for 10 months before the first operator was briefed. The raid took 38 minutes. Sun Tae took 27. The extra 11 minutes included walking to the 3rd floor. Simons died in 1979. Bull Simons, who had walked into the wrong compound and killed everyone in it and walked out to finish the actual mission. He never wrote a memoir. The doctrine he built didn't carry his name in any field manual. The C-130 touched down at Udorn in the dark, and the men climbed out into air so thick with humidity it felt like breathing through a wet towel. Fuel exhaust, jungle rot, the particular smell of a Thai airfield at 4 a.m., diesel and vegetation and standing water baking even before dawn. They were alive, every one of them. 56 men who had flown into the most defended airspace in Southeast Asia, spent 27 minutes on the ground, and come back without a scratch that required more than a bandage. The adrenaline was already curdling into something else. A debrief room, fluorescent lights, coffee that tasted like it had been made during the Kennedy administration, and the question nobody wanted to ask out loud because they already knew the answer. The cells were empty. The mission was a failure. That word, failure, sat on them for years. The classification held. Everything about Sun Tae went into a vault, and the men who executed it went back to Fort Bragg, back to their units, back to lives where they couldn't mention where they'd been, or what they'd done, or why it mattered. The letters they received were form letters. The medals came in closed ceremonies with no press, no families, no explanation beyond the citation language that had been scrubbed of operational detail until it read like an award for distinguished filing. A few men got silver stars. The classification meant they couldn't frame them next to a photograph of what they'd earned them doing. Simons received the Distinguished Service Cross. He put it in a drawer. What the raiders didn't know, couldn't know, because the intelligence was compartmented in the other direction now, was what the tap code had carried through Hoa Lo's walls. The consolidation, the morale shift, The change in how guards treated prisoners? The prisoners who spent 1971 and 72 in conditions measurably less brutal than the years before, because Hanoi had suddenly understood that these men were going home eventually and would remember every broken bone. The raid that rescued nobody had changed the calculus for every American prisoner in North Vietnam. The raiders sat at Fort Bragg believing they'd risked their lives for an empty building, while the men they'd gone to save were living the consequences of their success. The information gap between those two groups is one of the uglier details in this story, and it lasted decades. Some of the raiders met former POWs in the mid-70s, after the prisoners came home through Operation Homecoming in '73. The conversations were apparently difficult in a way nobody had anticipated. The POWs wanted to thank them. The raiders didn't know what they were being thanked for. When the former prisoners explained what had changed after the raid, the consolidation that ended years of solitary confinement, the communication networks that formed, the shift in guard behavior, the raiders heard for the first time that their mission had worked, just not the way the operations order described. Simons never had much patience for institutional recognition. By 1979, he was retired, living in Florida, technically done. Then, Ross Perot called. 2 electronic data systems employees were sitting in an Iranian prison during the revolution, and the State Department was producing paperwork instead of results. Perot asked Simons if he could get them out. Simons was 60 years old with a heart condition his doctors had been worried about for a decade. He went to Tehran, organized a prison assault using Iranian revolutionaries he'd recruited and trained in a matter of weeks, and extracted both men during the chaos of the regime's collapse. No official support, no intelligence apparatus, no 100 rehearsal cycle at a plywood compound. Just Bull Simons applying doctrine he'd written in rotor wash over Sun Tay to a problem the United States government had decided was too complicated to solve. He pulled it off with local nationals, cash, and the kind of operational certainty that comes from having done the impossible once already and finding it manageable. He died 4 months later, heart failure. The doctors had been right about the timeline, wrong about what he'd do with it. The Sun Tay Raiders held their first public reunion in 1986. 16 years after the mission, former POWs attended. The men who thought they'd failed spent an evening learning they hadn't, from the men who would know. The title of this video says 12 Rangers came back with 61 POWs. That didn't happen. The number was 56 men, drawn from special forces, not Rangers. They rescued 0 prisoners. The compound was empty and had been for 130 days. War stories compress. Details migrate from one event to another, one unit to another, one war to another, until what circulates bears about as much resemblance to the source material as a photocopy of a fax. Someone confused Sun Tay with the Cabanatuan raid of 1945. That one actually was Rangers, and they actually did bring back prisoners, 511 of them. The numbers got smaller in the retelling, the wars blurred, and the internet did what the internet does. The documented version doesn't need embellishment. 56 volunteers flew 216 miles into North Vietnam at night, landed under radar coverage so dense the Air Force had to manufacture a fake attack on Hanoi just to keep the screens busy, crashed a helicopter on purpose inside a compound the size of a parking lot, cleared every structure in under 2 minutes, fought a separate engagement at an installation they weren't supposed to be anywhere near, and extracted without a single fatality. The man running the ground operation was 60 years old and had a heart condition. His assault element leader landed at the wrong target, killed between 40 and 200 enemy soldiers. The records still conflict, and that gap should probably bother someone. And then walked to the right target and finished the job. The whole thing took 27 minutes. What makes Sun Tay stranger than the legend is the gap between execution and outcome. The mission worked perfectly and accomplished nothing it was designed to accomplish. Then it accomplished everything it wasn't designed to accomplish: consolidation, communication, morale, survival conditions, through consequences nobody predicted, and the raiders themselves didn't learn about for years. Nobody on the planning side, the flight crews, or in Hanoi, could have known what that raid would actually produce, least of all Hanoi, whose own panic set the real consequences in motion. The entire strategic impact of the Sun Tay raid was an accident. The guard in the Northwest Tower had been on duty since midnight. 4 hours of staring at an empty compound in a country where empty compounds don't get guard towers. He heard the helicopters before he saw them. The after-action report listed the mission as a tactical failure with no prisoners recovered, and someone at the Pentagon stamped it classified and put it in a drawer next to Simon's Distinguished Service Cross, where both of them sat for 16 years, doing nothing, meaning everything.